you had mentioned in a previous conversation that international education represented the largest growth market. So now we're talking about the business of staying in business of higher education. In order to be able to fund and create and perpetuate everything that you're talking about here, which goes to the very nature of our, as a country in the US and other countries, our competitive advantage, but just as we progress as a global society in the research and the breakthroughs and the things that we're doing. What did you mean by international education was the number one growth market for higher education?
Exactly. For instance, in 2022, there were 6.4 million students studying outside of their home countries.
Mhm.
So the global international enrollment was of over 6 million. And that represents a growth over the last decade. If we don't consider the pandemic years, if we go only within the decade of 2010 until 2020, global international enrollment grew by 70%, 70% in a decade.
Wow.
I'd love to see what other economic areas of activity grew by similar percentages within just one decade. The number of international students in the US grew exponentially. If we look at the 1950s, when really cultural exchanges, student exchanges, international enrollment really started taking off institutionally with programs like the Fulbright program that was created in 1946. If we look at the growth since, I really don't think there are many areas of economic activity that have that kind of growth in such a short time. Of course, that it's not a short time since the 1950s, but it is if you consider the type of growth that this activity has had, not only in the US, but more recently, everywhere around the world. From 2000 to 2022, the number grew by 4 times. Number of international students everywhere. It's really unbelievable. But again, if we look at the history of humankind, it has always been there. And of course, that if it was so difficult to travel back then, I can imagine what it was for a philosopher like Cicero just to go from Rome to Athens back in 79 BC, compared to what it would take now for any of us to go from, takes me, for instance, to go from Chicago to Athens to Greece if I wanted to, or from Detroit to Greece. It shouldn't be a surprise, but I think the numbers that make it more impactful are not only the numbers, not only the levels of economic impact, but also how diversity, all types of diversity, racial, ethnic, intellectual, cultural diversity has increased in our campuses. And that's also very important because we have to acknowledge that there are students who will never leave their home, their hometown, or their home state, or their home country. But they can have everywhere around the world in institutions that are truly internationalized. They can have a global education and an exposure to a representation of the world, a real representation of world cultures that happens at their doorstep. And I think that's really important because no matter where they are and where they will be for their entire life, if they never leave their home state, for instance, or their city, the world is still there. The fact that they work in and move and socialize in a globally interconnected world doesn't stop at the door of someone who has never left their city. They still have to deal with that global dimension in everything they do.
Actually, diversity is a very important point for students in deciding where they're going to go. After the cost of tuition, after the degrees that are being offered and the location, it's diversity. So it's not only something that betters us as individuals, but it's actually, as we're trying to address enrollment issues in decline, it is, after the top big three, it is the number one decision-making factor for students today. So what I'm hearing from you is that not only is there this global market to help address the decline in enrollments that is going up dramatically as enrollments overall are going down, but it's also diversity in culture and the sharing of ideas and research and economic impact